The Peter Principle by Lawrence J. Peter and Raymond Hall. This book is dedicated to all those who, working, playing, loving, living and dying at their level of incompetence, provided the data for the founding and development of the salutary science of hierarchiology. They saved others, themselves they could not save. Foreword. Dr. Peter's Useful and Hilarious Classic. By Robert I. Sutton. The Peter Principle came as a revelation to my father, Louis Sutton. He ran a little company in San Francisco called Oceanic Marine that sold furniture and related equipment, which he installed on United States Navy ships. His livelihood depended on U.S. government bureaucrats and shipyard managers, who often made him miserable. I grew up listening to his tirades about how these overpaid idiots insisted that he produce and procure poorly designed furnishings, how they could barely do their jobs, and how pathetically lazy they were. To make matters worse, senior government officials produced an onslaught of absurd procedures that required him to jump through an ever-expanding maze of administrative hoops, which wasted his time, drove up his costs, and made him crazy. He concluded, the morons at the top must be paid to waste as much taxpayer money as possible. My father loved the Peter Principle because it explained why life could be so maddening, and why everyone around you seems, or is doomed to become, incompetent. The people who ran the U.S. Navy and the shipyards didn't intend to do such lousy work. They were simply victims of Dr. Peter's immutable principle. They had been promoted inevitably, maddeningly, absurdly to their level of incompetence. Dr. Peter also taught my father not to expect the few competent bureaucrats and managers he encountered to stick around for long, as they would soon be promoted to a job that they were unable to perform properly. Dr. Peter even showed that such incompetence had pervaded my dad's business for hundreds of years. The book quotes a report from 1684 about the British Navy. The naval administration was a prodigy of wastefulness, corruption, ignorance, and indolence. No estimate could be trusted. No contract was performed. No check was enforced. My dad took special delight in the pseudo-scientific jargon that Dr. Peter invented to describe the weird and wasteful behaviors displayed by those languishing at their level of incompetence. Peter gave absurd and comedic names to the tragic realities of working life, the root of the entire book, the condition of incompetence. That Peter called final placement syndrome, leads some to develop abnormal tabulology, an unusual and highly significant arrangement of his desk. This pathology is manifested, for example, in tabulatory gigantism, an obsession with having a bigger desk than his colleagues. My father's business was especially afflicted with the teeter-totter syndrome, a complete inability to make science, and machinatory inertia, the habit of telling jokes instead of getting on with business. As with so many others who were buoyed by this international bestseller, Dr. Peter's sense of the absurd helped my father combat this tragedy of ineptitude by responding with laughter rather than rage. I have a soft spot for the Peter Principle because my dad loved it so much. Before revisiting it to write this foreword, I hadn't read it since it was first published in 1969, when I was 15. I expected it would be a quaint curiosity, that Dr. Peter's old book would be largely irrelevant to today's workplace. I presumed that the application of business knowledge developed over the last 40 years would have stamped out many maladies described by Dr. Peter, that market forces would have eliminated many or most organizations that were riddled with incompetence, and that subsequent writings on the subject would be more useful and engaging than the Peter Principle. I was wrong on all three counts. Yes, the book is archaic in some ways, especially in its use of sexist language and examples. Yet the book's main ideas remain as pertinent to running and working in an organization today as they were 40 years ago. None of this would have surprised Dr. Peter, who depicted his ideas as timeless and immutable facts of organizational life. Incompetence, he argued, knows no barrier of time or place. Dr. Peter observed that one reason so many employees are incompetent is that the skills required to get a job often have nothing to do with what is required to do the job itself. The skills required to run a great political campaign have little to do with the skills required to govern. There is nothing about being a great surgeon that prepares a doctor to run a hospital. Learning to be a great litigator in no way prepares a lawyer to run a law firm. Many organizations, from hospitals to law firms, use such standards to select new leaders, yet devote little or no attention to their management skills. They often end up with lousy leaders and lose their best individual performers. These observations remain just as true in 2009 as they did in 1969. Or consider Dr. Peter's counterintuitive claim that in most hierarchies, supercompetence is more objectionable than incompetence. He warned that extremely skilled and productive employees often face criticism, and are fired if they don't start performing worse. Their presence disrupts and therefore violates the first commandment of hierarchical life: the hierarchy must be preserved. Unfortunately, this pattern persists in many modern organizations. Several fantastic teachers that I know at prestigious universities have been pressured by peers and leaders to do a worse job of teaching because you are making everyone else look bad. One of these professors insists that he received tenure partly because he worked to earn teaching evaluations that were no better than those of the professors who evaluated his case. Even the youngest supercompetent people in our society still face criticism and ostracism, like 9-year-old Jericho Scott, a star Little League baseball pitcher in New Haven, Connecticut. Jericho had never hurt an opposing player with his well-controlled, 40-mile-per-hour fastball. But when his coach refused to stop Jericho from pitching, the league hierarchy responded by barring Jerry Cho from pitching and disbanding his undefeated team. Jericho's coach complained, to no avail, that his young star was punished for being too good. As for Jericho, he told the Associated Press that I feel sad, and that I feel like it's all my fault nobody could play. If Jericho wants to play in this league, I guess his choices are to play another position, like second base, where he isn't super competent, or to figure out how to become a mediocre pitcher. Another reason the Peter Principle has no peer is that it somehow manages to be devilishly silly yet accurate and useful all at the same time. It reads like a first-rate parody of a business book. It reminds me of the best stuff in Mad Magazine or The Onion. Satire works when it exposes the truth and it upends fallacy. The Peter Principle is so funny because it is so true. It is filled with practical ideas that we can all use to limit the damage that incompetence does to our organizations and ourselves. One reason the book is so hilarious is that Dr. Peter was not only an incisive thinker but masterfully creative with words. If Dr. Seuss and Peter Drucker had joined forces to write a business book, the Peter Principle might have been the result. Peter invented dozens of strange, stilted, and pseudoscientific phrases and words. I suggest reading the glossary of over 100 phrases and words from the Science of Hierarchology in the back before turning to the rest of the book. The translations will help you absorb Dr. Peter's ideas more quickly and more deeply. Plus, the silly pseudoscientific jargon, paired with well-crafted definitions, will get you into the right mindset for entering Dr. Peter's strange and wonderful world. Words he invented, such as hierarchology, structurophilia, and staticmanship, weren't in any dictionary in 1969, and don't seem to have entered the English language some 40 years later. And I can't find any behavioral science research on terms such as percussive sublimation, being kicked upstairs, a pseudo-promotion, and Peter circumambulation, a detour around a super-incumbent, who is a person above you who, having reached his level of incompetence, blocks your path to promotion. All these words sound just like the jargon used in well-developed scientific fields. Yet, unlike experts who unintentionally develop absurd and often incomprehensible jargon, Dr. Peter meant to be silly when he invented the language for a field that did not, and still does not, exist. The silliness persists with the names invented for case studies of employees and organizations. People such as J.S. Minion, G. Spender, and Miss T. Totland, or organizations such as the Excelsior City Special Education Department, are given fake names, and it is often difficult to tell if the stories themselves are real or fictional. The boldness of Dr. Peters' claims also somehow mocks the overconfidence that runs through most self-help and business books, while simultaneously making his arguments more convincing. He states repeatedly that there are no exceptions to the Peter Principle. This claim is absurd on the face of it because, as he says, the science of hierarchiology is based on limited evidence and requires much work to develop. Yet taking such a strong position enabled Dr. Peter to present his ideas in efficient and persuasive ways. I laughed a lot through Chapter 3, which argues that all apparent exceptions to the Peter Principle are not exceptions at all. In rapid-fire fashion, he shows that percussive sublimation, the paternal instep, promoting a family member several steps above his or her level of incompetence, and a host of other apparent exceptions to the principle, in fact, demonstrate the power of the principle. By the end of the chapter, I suspect that many of the most cynical and logical readers will be convinced by his arguments. That is the wonderful thing about the Peter Principle. It doesn't seem to matter that the jargon, names, and stories are fake. It doesn't seem to matter that many of the assertions are twisted and, at times, seemingly wildly illogical. Somehow, despite, or perhaps because, of all this nonsense, a host of accurate and useful ideas emerge from this masterpiece. The validity of these ideas isn't just supported by Dr. Peters' rhetorical flourish and keen eye. Many of Dr. Peters' ideas are also supported by modern behavioral science research. Stanford professor and renowned economist Edward P. Lazier published an academic paper in 2001 called The Peter Principle, A Theory of Decline. Professor Lazier provides a string of impressive and, to most of us, incomprehensible mathematical formulas to explain why individuals perform worse after having received promotion. He lends mathematical proof to the truth Peter revealed through close, and cynical, observation. Some of these formulas show that, even if all employees promoted to the next level were competent in their previous jobs, some percentage will be incompetent in their new jobs. Professor Lazier lifts this assertion directly from the Peter Principle. He then calculates, just as Drive Peter proposed, that this age-old scenario occurs partly because performance standards get tougher as one moves up the hierarchy. To give you a taste, here is just one of the many intertwined formulas Professor Lazier provides. A plus A1, A plus 1A, A plus E2, A plus 1A. Got that? Neither do I. I have no idea what this formula means, but Lazier concludes after this fancy math, thus, expected ability falls for promoted individuals from period 1 to period 2. Not all research that supports Dr. Peters' assertions about hierarchiology is so difficult to understand. Professor Lazier summarizes a host of other, simpler studies suggesting that people with stronger skills tend to be promoted more quickly and that people with weaker skills tend to get stuck in their current jobs after just 1 or 2 promotions, as the Peter Principle proposes. Research related to the Peter Principle confirms that many of these ideas aren't just right, they are also useful. Dr. Peter provides advice for employees who strive to rise to their level of incompetence as quickly as possible. We all fail upward, though some of us do so sooner than others. Dr. Peter explains, for example, how an employee can use a patron to pull him up the hierarchy, along with details about how to motivate the patron, how to get around people who block the way, and ways that multiple patrons can join together to pull an employee up the hierarchy. Much of Dr. Peters' advice about using pull echoes Jeffrey Pfeffer's Managing with Power, the main text used in many business schools to teach MBAs how to get ahead in organizations. Pfeffer's analysis and advice is more detailed and sophisticated, but the basic ideas are remarkably similar. The Peter Principle also offers many promising ideas that have yet to be studied carefully. I would be curious, for instance, to see research on Dr. Peters' assertion that ignorance is bliss. Peter contends that many employees never realize they have reached their level of incompetence, which he proposes is good for an employee because he keeps perpetually busy, never loses his expectation of further promotion, and so remains happy and healthy. This conclusion clashes with numerous experts who exhort employees, especially managers, to face brutal truths and hard facts. The idea behind most employee performance evaluations is that, if you give employees accurate feedback about their strengths and weaknesses, they will be motivated to eliminate the weaknesses, and thus perform better. Dr. Peter uses entirely different logic. He asserts that many employees in every organization have risen to their level of incompetence, all will do so eventually, and organizations rarely fire incompetent people. Sounds right, doesn't it? Following this logic, performance evaluations given to people who have achieved final placement might best be used to fuel their delusions of competence, not to identify weaknesses they are incapable of repairing. I've never heard of a performance evaluation system designed to provoke ignorance and denial, but Dr. Peter's logic suggests that such a system would lead to happier and healthier employees, thus reducing sick days and employee turnover. Creative incompetence is another idea from the Peter principle ripe for development. Peter believed that doing things badly, intentionally, and publicly was the best way for an employee to avoid final placement and, if widely applied, the best way to build organizations filled with competent people. Dr. Peter tells a story about P. Green, a competent gardener who loved his work and had no interest in promotion to foreman. Rather than taking the risk of being offered a promotion, which would be difficult to decline, P. Green intentionally loses numerous receipts and packing slips, which leads to reprimands from the accounting department and causes his superiors to conclude that he has achieved final placement. The popular press occasionally writes about this theme, such as in Jared Sandberg's 2007 Wall Street Journal piece on the virtues of strategic incompetence. Sandberg reports that a manager named Steve Crawley was assigned to organize an office picnic, but was eventually relieved of the job, which he didn't want, by intentionally demonstrating deep confusion and incompetence. As Sandberg concludes, strategic incompetence isn't about having a strategy that fails, but a failure that succeeds. It almost always works to deflect work one doesn't want to do, without ever having to admit it. More research is needed to see if creative incompetence is a widespread and effective strategy, but my mind races ahead, regardless. Imagine university classes and management workshops where students learn how to dress in slightly unprofessional ways, or how to give poor and boring speeches. I can hear the professor advising, mumble more and please stop looking at the audience, and how to forget to attend scheduled meetings with superiors so they will conclude that you have reached your level of incompetence. If incompetence is inevitable, perhaps we should all learn to master it on our own terms, and stop spending so much time trying to achieve competence, which is, by Peter's definition, elusive. As strange as Dr. Peter's twisted take on organizational hierarchies may seem, the book's core ideas, and many of the crazy little ideas too, are valid facts of organizational life. After reading this book a few times, I suspect I know why Dr. Peter, and co-author Raymond Hall, decided to cloak these ideas in such a delightfully weird and perversely funny package. The Peter principle clashes with piles of serious advice spewed out by an enormous industry of business educators, consultants, and gurus. This was true in 1969 and truer in 2009. Perhaps Dr. Peter realized that these unconventional and contrary ideas wouldn't spread if they were enclosed in the usual, overly somber business book. The success and enduring relevance of this gem suggests that, regardless of Dr. Peter's intentions, writing a serious Boosie-ness book disguised as a parody was a stroke of genius. Additional foreword by Lawrence J. Peter. It is sometimes difficult for the discoverer of a principle to identify accurately that moment when the revelation occurred. The Peter principle did not enter my consciousness in a flash of recognition, but I became aware of it gradually over several years of observation of man's incompetence. It therefore seems appropriate I should present the reader with a historical account of my discovery. A clot for every slot. Although some people function competently, I observed others who had risen above their level of competence and were habitually bungling their jobs, frustrating their coworkers and eroding the efficiency of the organization. It was logical to conclude that for every job that existed in the world there was someone, somewhere, who could not do it. Given sufficient time and enough promotions, he would get that job. I was not concerned with the oversight, the slip of the tongue, the faux pas, the occasional error which can be an embarrassment to any of us. Anyone can make a mistake. The most competent men throughout history have had their lapses. Conversely, the habitually incompetent can, by random action, be right once in a while. Instead, I was searching for the underlying principle which would explain why so many important positions were occupied by persons incompetent to fulfill the due ties and responsibilities of their respective offices. Right at the top, the first public presentation of the Peter Principle occurred at a seminar in September 1960, when I addressed a group of directors of federally funded educational research projects. Because each participant had written a successful grant proposal, each had been rewarded by a promotion to a position as director of one or more research projects. Some of these men actually had research skills, but this was irrelevant to their acquiring the directorship. Many others were inept at research design and, in desperation, were simply intending to replicate some oft-repeated statistical exercise. As I became aware of their plan to spend time and taxpayers' money on rediscovering the wheel, I decided to explain their predicament by introducing them to the Peter Principle. Their reaction to my presentation was a mixture of hostility and laughter. A young statistician in the group convulsed with laughter and literally fell from his chair. Later he confided that his intense reaction was caused by my humorous presentation of outrageous ideas, while at the same time he was watching the district research director's face turn red, then purple. Tongue in both cheeks. Although case studies were accurately compiled and data realistic, I had decided to present the Peter Principle exclusively in satirical form. Therefore, in all lectures from 1960 to 1964, and in the articles that followed, examples with a humorous connotation were used and fictitious names were employed to protect the guilty. All rights reserved. It was in December 1963, during the intermission of a badly presented play, that I explained to Raymond Hull why the actor playing the lead was saying his lines with his back to the audience and gesturing into the wings. This formerly competent actor had found his level of incompetence by attempting to be a combination actor-director-producer. In the conversation that ensued, Mr. Hull convinced me that I was not doing justice to the Peter Principle by presenting it to only a select few who might attend my lectures. He insisted that it should be available to the world in book form. He further suggested that without publication and copyright, someone else might attach his name to my discovery. A collaboration was agreed upon and the manuscript was completed in the spring of 1965. Victims of the Peter Principle, the final manuscript was submitted to the editors of a number of major publishing houses. The first returned it with an accompanying letter which stated, "We can see no commercial possibilities for this work and cannot encourage you to continue with it. Even with interdivisional sales, the publication of this work is not warranted." The next editor wrote, "You should not deal so lightly with such a serious topic." Another suggested, "If you are writing a comedy, it should not contain so many tragic case studies." Still another said, "I will reconsider publication if you will make up your mind and rewrite this as a humorous book or as a serious scientific work." 14 rejection notices, and 2 years later I began to doubt whether the world was ready for my discovery. A bit at a time it was decided that if the publishing world was not ready for a book, then perhaps we might introduce the Peter Principle gradually through several short articles. Mr. Hull completed an article for Esquire magazine for December 1966. Later I wrote about the principle for West magazine, Los Angeles Times, April 17, 1967. The response to this article was overwhelming. Over 400 letters were received within a few months. Requests for lectures and articles poured in and as many as possible were fulfilled. The selling of the principle, 1968. In March 1968, the president of William Morrow inquired about the possibility of a book about the Peter Principle. I dusted off the manuscript and handed it to a William Morrow editor. The book, released in February 1969, gradually climbed to the #1 position on the nonfiction bestseller list, where it stayed for 20 weeks. It remained on the bestseller list for over a year and has now been translated into 14 languages. The book has been required reading in a number of university courses and has been the subject of discussion for many seminars. The book has also inspired several serious research projects in investigating the validity of the principle. Each research supports the correctness of my observations. Quit while you are behind. Since publication of the book, I have had many opportunities to reach my own level of incompetence in one giant step. I have declined many offers to become a management consultant and to conduct seminars for business administrators. Although these proposals were rejected, I have not been protected from the Peter Principle. Recently, a school of business administration invited me to give a lecture and then scheduled my appearance in no less than 5 different rooms at the same time. An association of industrial engineers and systems experts asked me to address their convention but misinformed me regarding the date, the time, and the place. Appliances I have purchased still fail to operate, or break down within 30 days. My car is returned from the service shop with mysterious defects, and the government continues to increase the number of regulations which influence my life, while it ensnares itself in bureaucratic red tape. Death is nature's warning to slow down. As individuals, we tend to climb to our levels of incompetence. We behave as though up is better and more is better, and yet all around us we see the tragic victims of this mindless escalation. We see men in groups, and most of the human race, struggling for status on a treadmill to oblivion, escalating warfare and weaponry to overkill the population of the world, escalating production of power and products while polluting the environment and upsetting the life-supporting ecological balance. If man is going to rescue himself from a future intolerable existence, he must first see where his unmindful escalation is leading him. He must examine his objectives and see that true progress is achieved through moving forward to a better way of life, rather than upward to total life incompetence. Man must realize that improvement of the quality of experience is more important than the acquisition of useless artifacts and material possessions. He must reassess the meaning of life and decide whether he will use his intellect and technology for the preservation of the human race and the development of the humanistic characteristics of man, or whether he will continue to utilize his creative potential in escalating a super-colossal death trap. Man, on occasion, has caught a glimpse of his reflection in a mirror, and not immediately recognizing himself, has begun to laugh before realizing what he was doing. It is in such moments that true progress toward understanding has occurred. This book is intended to be that mirror. Lawrence J. Peter. August, 1970. Introduction. By Raymond Hall. As an author and journalist, I have had exceptional opportunities to study the workings of civilized society. I have investigated and written about government, industry, business, education and the arts. I have talked to, and listened carefully to, members of many trades and professions, people of lofty, middling and lowly stations. I have noticed that, with few exceptions, men bungle their affairs. Everywhere I see incompetence rampant, incompetence triumphant. I have seen a 3/4-mile long highway bridge collapse and fall into the sea because, despite checks and double checks, someone had botched the design of a supporting pier. I have seen town planners supervising the development of a city on the floodplain of a great river, where it is certain to be periodically inundated. Lately I read about the collapse of 3 giant cooling towers at a British power station. They cost $1 million each, but were not strong enough to withstand a good blow of wind. I noted with interest that the indoor baseball stadium at Houston, Texas, was found on completion to be peculiarly ill-suited to baseball. On bright days, fielders could not see fly balls against the glare of the skylights. I observed that appliance manufacturers, as regular policy, establish regional service depots in the expectation, justified by experience, that many of their machines will break down during the warranty period. Having listened to umpteen motorists' complaints about faults in their new cars, I was not surprised to learn that roughly 1/5 of the automobiles produced by major manufacturers in recent years have been found to contain potentially dangerous production defects. Please do not assume that I am a jaundiced ultra-conservative, crying down contemporary men and things just because they are contemporary. Incompetence knows no barriers of time or place. Macaulay gives a picture, drawn from a report by Samuel Pepys, of the British Navy in 1684. The naval administration was a prodigy of wastefulness, corruption, ignorance, and indolence. No estimate could be trusted. No contract was performed. No check was enforced. Some of the new men of war were so rotten that, unless speedily repaired, they would go down at their moorings. The sailors were paid with so little punctuality that they were glad to find some usurer who would purchase their tickets at 40% discount. Most of the ships which were afloat were commanded by men who had not been bred to the sea. Wellington, examining the roster of officers assigned to him for the 1810 campaign in Portugal, said, "I only hope that when the enemy reads the list of their names, he trembles as I do." Civil War General Richard Taylor, speaking of the Battle of the 7 Days, remarked, "Confederate commanders knew no more about the topography within a day's march of the city of Richmond than they did about Central Africa." Robert E. Lee once complained bitterly, "I cannot have my orders carried out." For most of World War II the British armed forces fought with explosives much inferior, weight for weight, to those in German shells and bombs. Early in 1940, British scientists knew that the cheap, simple addition of a little powdered aluminum would double the power of existing explosives, yet the knowledge was not applied till late in 1943. In the same war, the Australian commander of a hospital ship checked the vase cell's water tanks after a refit and found them painted inside with red lead. It would have poisoned every man aboard. These things, and hundreds more like them, I have seen and read about and heard about. I have accepted the universality of incompetence. I have stopped being surprised when a moon rocket fails to get off the ground because something is forgotten, something breaks, something doesn't work, or something explodes prematurely. I am no longer amazed to observe that a government-employed marriage counselor is a homosexual. I now expect that statesmen will prove incompetent to fulfill their campaign pledges. I assume that if they do anything, it will probably be to carry out the pledges of their opponents. This incompetence would be annoying enough if it were confined to public works, politics, space travel and such vast, remote fields of human endeavor. But it is not. It is close at hand, too, an ever-present, pestiferous nuisance. As I write this page, the woman in the next apartment is talking on the telephone. I can hear every word she says. It is 10 p.m. and the man in the apartment on the other side of me has gone to bed early with a cold. I hear his intermittent cough. When he turns on his bed I hear the springs squeak. I don't live in a cheap rooming house, this is an expensive, modern, concrete high-rise apartment block. What's the matter with the people who designed and built it? The other day a friend of mine bought a hacksaw, took it home and began to cut an iron bolt. At his second stroke, the saw blade snapped, and the adjustable joint of the frame broke so that it could not be used again. Last week I wanted to use a tape recorder on the stage of a new high school auditorium. I could get no power for the machine. The building engineer told me that, in a year's occupancy, he had been unable to find a switch that would turn on current in the bass plugs on stage. He was beginning to think they were not wired up at all. This morning I set out to buy a desk lamp. In a large furniture and appliance store I found a lamp that I liked. The salesman was going to wrap it, but I asked him to test it first. I'm getting cautious nowadays. He was obviously unused to testing electrical equipment, because it took him a long time to find a socket. Eventually he plugged the lamp in, then could not switch it on. He tried another lamp of the same style, that would not switch on, either. The whole consignment had defective switches. I left. I recently ordered 600 square feet of fiberglass insulation for a cottage I am renovating. I stood over the clerk at the order desk to make sure she got the quantity right. In vain. The building supply firm billed me for 700 square feet, and delivered 900 square feet. Education, often touted as a cure for all ills, is apparently no cure for incompetence. Incompetence runs riot in the halls of education. One high school graduate in 3 cannot read at normal 5th grade level. It is now commonplace for colleges to be giving reading lessons to freshmen. In some colleges, 20% of freshmen cannot read well enough to understand their textbooks. I receive mail from a large university. 15 months ago I changed my address. I sent the usual notice to the university, my mail kept going to the old address. After 2 more change of address notices and a phone call, I made a personal visit. I pointed with my finger to the wrong address in their records, dictated the new address and watched a secretary take it down. The mail still went to the old address. 2 days ago there was a new development. I received a phone call from the woman who had succeeded me in my old apartment and who, of course, had been receiving my mail from the university. She herself has just moved again, and my mail from the university has now started going to her new address. As I said, I became resigned to this omnipresent incompetence. Yet I thought that, if only its cause could be discovered, then a cure might be found. So I began asking questions. I heard plenty of theories. A banker blamed the schools, kids nowadays don't learn efficient work habits. A teacher blamed politicians, with such inefficiency at the seat of government, what can you expect from citizens? Besides, they resist our legitimate demands for adequate education budgets. If only we could get a computer in every school. An atheist blamed the churches, drugging the people's minds with fables of a better world, and distracting them from practicalities. A churchman blamed radio, television and movies. Many distractions of modern life have drawn people away from the moral teachings of the church. A trade unionist blamed management. Too greedy to pay a living wage. A man can't take any interest in his job on this starvation pay. A manager blamed unions, the worker just doesn't care nowadays, thinks of nothing but raises, vacations and retirement pensions. An individualist said that welfare statism produces a general don't care attitude. A social worker told me that moral laxity in the home and family breakdown produces irresponsibility on the job. A psychologist said that early repression of sexual impulses causes a subconscious desire to fail, as atonement for guilt feelings. A philosopher said, men are human, accidents will happen. A multitude of different explanations is as bad as no explanation at all. I began to feel that I would never understand incompetence. Then one evening, in a theater lobby, during the second intermission of a dully performed play, I was grumbling about incompetent actors and directors, and got into conversation with Dr. Lawrence J. Peter, a scientist who had devoted many years to the study of incompetence. The intermission was too short for him to do more than whet my curiosity. After the show I went to his home and sat till 3 a.m. listening to his lucid, startlingly original exposition of a theory that at last answered my question, why incompetence? Dr. Peter exonerated Adam, agitators and accident, and arraigned one feature of our society as the perpetrator and rewarder of incompetence. Incompetence explained. My mind flamed at the thought. Perhaps the next step might be incompetence eradicated. With characteristic modesty, Dr. Peter had so far been satisfied to discuss his discovery with a few friends and colleagues and give an occasional lecture on his research. His vast collection of incompetenciana, his brilliant galaxy of incompetence theories and formulae, had never appeared in print. Possibly my principle could benefit mankind, said Peter, but I'm frantically busy with routine teaching and the associated paperwork. Then there are faculty committee meetings, and my continuing research. Someday I may sort out the material and arrange it for publication, but for the next 10 or 15 years I simply won't have time. I stressed the danger of procrastination, and at last Dr. Peter agreed to a collab. Oration, He would place his extensive research reports and huge manuscript at my disposal. I would condense them into a book. The following pages present Professor Peter's explanation of his principle, the most penetrating social and psychological discovery of the century. Dare you read it? Dare you face, in one blinding revelation, the reason why schools do not bestow wisdom, why governments cannot maintain order, why courts do not dispense justice, why prosperity fails to produce happiness, why utopian plans never generate utopias? Do not decide lightly. The decision to read on is irrevocable. If you read, you can never regain your present state of blissful ignorance. You will never again unthinkingly venerate your superiors or dominate your subordinates. Never. The Peter principle, once heard, cannot be forgotten. What have you to gain by reading on? By conquering incompetence in yourself. And by understanding incompetence in others, you can do your own work more easily, gain promotion and make more money. You can avoid painful illnesses. You can become a leader of men. You can enjoy your leisure. You can gratify your friends, confound your enemies, impress your children and enrich and revitalize your marriage. This knowledge, in short, will revolutionize your life, perhaps save it. So, if you have courage, read on, mark, memorize and apply the Peter Principle. Chapter 1. The Peter Principle. I begin to smell a rat. M. de Cervantes. When I was a boy I was taught that the men upstairs knew what they were doing. I was told, Peter, the more you know, the further you go. So I stayed in school until I graduated from college and then went forth into the world clutching firmly these ideas and my new teaching certificate. During the first year of teaching I was upset to find that a number of teachers, school principals, supervisors and superintendents appeared to be unaware of their professional responsibilities and incompetent in executing their duties. For example, my principal's main concerns were that all window shades be at the same level, that classrooms should be quiet and that no one step on or near the rose beds. The superintendent's main concerns were that no minority group, no matter how fanatical, should ever be offended and that all official forms be submitted on time. The children's education appeared farthest from the administrator mind. At first I thought this was a special weakness of the school system in which I taught, so I applied for certification in another province. I filled out the special forms, enclosed the required documents and complied willingly with all the red tape. Several weeks later, back came my application and all the documents. No, there was nothing wrong with my credentials, the forms were correctly filled out, an official departmental stamp showed that they had been received in good order. But an accompanying letter said, the new regulations require that such forms cannot be accepted by the Department of Education unless they have been registered at the post office to ensure safe delivery. Will you please remail the forms to the department, making sure to register them this time? I began to suspect that the local school system did not have a monopoly on incompetence. As I looked further afield, I saw that every organization contained a number of persons who could not do their jobs. A universal phenomenon, occupational incompetence, is everywhere. Have you noticed it? Probably we all have noticed it. We see indecisive politicians posing as resolute statesmen and the authoritative source who blames his misinformation on situational imponderables. Limitless are the public servants who are indolent and insolent, military commandeurs whose behavioral timidity belies their dreadnought rhetoric, and governors whose innate servility prevents their actually governing. In our sophistication, we virtually shrug aside the immoral cleric, corrupt judge, incoherent attorney, author who cannot write and English teacher who cannot spell. At universities we see proclamations authored by administrators whose own office communications are hopelessly muddled, and droning lectures from inaudible or incomprehensible instructors. Seeing incompetence at all levels of every hierarchy, political, legal, educational and industrial, I hypothesized that the cause was some inherent feature of the rules governing the placement of employees. Thus began my serious study of the ways in which employees move upward through a hierarchy, and of what happens to them after promotion. For my scientific data, hundreds of case histories were collected. Here are 3 typical examples. Municipal Government File, Case No. 17J. S. Minion Superscript 1 was a maintenance foreman in the Public Works Department of Excelsior City. He was a favorite of the senior officials at City Hall. They all praised his unfailing affability. "I like Minion," said the Superintendent of Works. "He has good judgment and is always pleasant and agreeable." This behavior was appropriate for Minion's position. He was not supposed to make policy, so he had no need to disagree with his superiors. The Superintendent of Works retired and Minion succeeded him. Minion continued to agree with everyone. He passed to his foreman every suggestion that came from above. The resulting conflicts in policy, and the continual changing of plans, soon demoralized the department. Complaints poured in from the mayor and other officials, from taxpayers and from the maintenance workers' union. Minion still says yes to everyone, and carries messages briskly back and forth between his superiors and his subordinates. Nominally a superintendent, he actually does the work of a messenger. The maintenance department regularly exceeds its budget, yet fails to fulfill its program of work. In short, Minion, a competent foreman, became an incompetent superintendent. Service Industries File, Case No. 3E. Tinker was exceptionally zealous and intelligent as an apprentice at G. Reese Auto Repair Incorporated, and soon rose to journeyman mechanic. In this job he showed outstanding ability in diagnosing obscure faults, and endless patience in correcting them. He was promoted to foreman of the repair shop. But here his love of things mechanical and his perfectionism become liabilities. He will undertake any job that he thinks looks interesting, no matter how busy the shop may be. "We'll work it in somehow," he says. He will not let a job go until he is fully satisfied with it. He meddles constantly. He is seldom to be found at his desk. He is usually up to his elbows in a dismantled motor, and while the man who should be doing the work stands watching, other workmen sit around waiting to be assigned new tasks. As a result, the shop is always overcrowded with work, always in a muddle, and delivery times are often missed. Tinker cannot understand that the average customer cares little about perfect tie-in. He wants his car back on time. He cannot understand that most of his men are less interested in motors than in their paychecks. So Tinker cannot get on with his customers or with his subordinates. He was a competent mechanic, but is now an incompetent foreman. Military File, Case No. 8. Consider the case of the late renowned General A. Goodwin. His hearty, informal manner, his racy style of speech, his scorn for petty regulations and his undoubted personal bravery made him the idol of his men. He led them to many well-deserved victories. When Goodwin was promoted to Field Marshal, he had to deal, not with ordinary soldiers, but with politicians and allied generalissimos. He would not conform to the necessary protocol. He could not turn his tongue to the conventional courtesies and flatteries. He quarreled with all the dignitaries and took to lying for days at a time, drunk and sulking, in his trailer. The conduct of the war slipped out of his hands into those of his subordinates. He had been promoted to a position that he was incompetent to fill. An important clue. In time I saw that all such cases had a common feature. The employee had been promoted from a position of competence to a position of incompetence. I saw that, sooner or later, this could happen to every employee in every hierarchy. Hypothetical Case File, Case No. 1. Suppose you own a pill rolling factory, Perfect Pill Incorporated. Your foreman pill roller dies of a perforated ulcer. You need a replacement. You naturally look among your rank and file pill rollers. Miss Oval, Mrs. Cylinder, Mr. Ellipse and Mr. Cube all show various degrees of incompetence. They will naturally be ineligible for promotion. You will choose, other things being equal, your most competent pill roller, Mr. Sphere, and promote him to foreman. Now suppose Mr. Sphere proves competent as foreman. Later, when your general foreman, Legree, moves up to works manager, Sphere will be eligible to take his place. If, on the other hand, Sphere is an incompetent foreman, he will get no more promotion. He has reached what I call his level of incompetence. He will stay there till the end of his career. Some employees, like Ellipse and Cube, reach a level of incompetence in the lowest grade and are never promoted. Some, like Sphere, assuming he is not a satisfactory foreman, reach it after one promotion. E. Tinker, the automobile repair shop foreman, reached his level of incompetence on the third stage of the hierarchy. General Goodwin reached his level of incompetence at the very top of the hierarchy. So my analysis of hundreds of cases of occupational incompetence led me on to formulate the Peter Principle. In a hierarchy, every employee tends to rise to his level of incompetence. A new science. Having formulated the principle, I discovered that I had inadvertently founded a new science, hierarchology, the study of hierarchies. The term hierarchy was originally used to describe the system of church government by priests graded into ranks. The contemporary meaning includes any organization whose members or employees are arranged in order of rank, grade or class. Hierarchology, although a relatively recent discipline, appears to have great applicability to the fields of public and private administration. This means My principle is the key to an understanding of all hierarchical systems, and therefore to an understanding of the whole structure of civilization. A few eccentrics try to avoid getting involved with hierarchies, but everyone in business, industry, trade unionism, politics, government, the armed forces, religion and education is so involved. All of them are controlled by the Peter Principle. Many of them, to be sure, may win a promotion or two, moving from one level of competence to a higher level of competence. But competence in that new position qualifies them for still another promotion. For each individual, for you, for me, the final promotion is from a level of competence to a level of incompetence. Squared. So, given enough time, and assuming the existence of enough ranks in the hierarchy, each employee rises to, and remains at, his level of incompetence. Peter's corollary states, in time, every post tends to be occupied by an employee who is incompetent to carry out its duties. Who turns the wheels? You will rarely find, of course, a system in which every employee has reached his level of incompetence. In most instances, something is being done to further the ostensible purposes for which the hierarchy exists. Work is accomplished by those employees who have not yet reached their level of incompetence. Chapter 2. The Principle in Action. To tell tales out of school. J. Haywood. A study of a typical hierarchy, the Excelsior City school system, will show how the Peter Principle works within the teaching profession. Study this example and understand how hierarchology operates within every establishment. Let us begin with the rank and file classroom teachers. I group them, for this analysis, into three classes: competent, moderately competent and incompetent. Distribution theory predicts, and experience confirms, that teachers will be distributed unevenly in these classes, the majority in the moderately competent class, minorities in the competent and incompetent classes. This graph illustrates the distribution. The case of the conformist and incompetent teacher is ineligible for promotion. Dorothea D. Ditto, for example, had been an extremely conforming student in college. Her assignments were either plagiarisms from textbooks and journals, or transcriptions of the professor's lectures. She always did exactly as she was told, no more, no less. She was considered to be a competent student. She graduated with honors from the Excelsior Teachers College. When she became a teacher, she taught exactly as she herself had been taught. She followed precisely the textbook, the curriculum guide and the bell schedule. Her work goes fairly well, except when no rule or precedent is available. For example, when a water pipe burst and flooded the classroom floor, Miss Ditto kept on teaching until the principal rushed in and rescued the class. "Miss Ditto!" he cried. "In the name of the superintendent! There are 3 inches of water on this floor. Why is your class still here? She replied, I didn't hear the emergency bell signal. I pay attention to those things. You know I do. I'm certain you didn't sound the bell. Flummoxed before the power of her awesome non sequitur, the principal invoked a provision of the school code giving him emergency powers in an extraordinary circumstance and led her sopping class from the building. So, although she never breaks a rule or disobeys an order, she is often in trouble, and will never gain promotion. Competent as a student, she has reached her level of incompetence as a classroom teacher, and will therefore remain in that position throughout her teaching career. The eligible majority most beginning teachers are moderately competent or competent, see the area from B to D on the graph, and they will all be eligible for promotion. Here is one such case. A latent weakness. Mr. N. Beaker had been a competent student, and became a popular science teacher. His lessons and lab periods were inspiring, his students were cooperative and Chapter 2. The principle in action to tell tales out of school. J. Haywood. A study of a typical hierarchy, the Excelsior City school system, will show how the Peter Principle works within the teaching profession. Study this example and understand how hierarchology operates within every establishment. Let us begin with the rank and file classroom teachers. I group them, for this analysis, into 3 classes: competent, moderately competent and incompetent. Distribution theory predicts, and experience confirms, that teachers will be distributed unevenly in these classes, the majority in the moderately competent class, minorities in the competent and incompetent classes. This graph illustrates the distribution. The case of the conformist. An incompetent teacher is ineligible for promotion. Dorothea D. Ditto, for example, had been an extremely conforming student in college. Her assignments were either plagiarisms from textbooks and journals, or transcriptions of the professor's lectures. She always did exactly as she was told, no more, no less. She was considered to be a competent student. She graduated with honors from the Excelsior Teachers College. When she became a teacher, she taught exactly as she herself had been taught. She followed precisely the textbook, the curriculum guide and the bell schedule. Her work goes fairly well, except when no rule or precedent is available. For example, when a water pipe burst and flooded the classroom floor, Miss Ditto kept on teaching until the principal rushed in and rescued the class. "Miss Ditto!" he cried. "In the name of the superintendent. There are 3 inches of water on this floor. Why is your class still here?" She replied, "I didn't hear the emergency bell signal. I pay attention to those things. You know I do. I'm certain you didn't sound the bell." Flummoxed before the power of her awesome non sequitur, the principal invoked a provision of the school code giving him emergency powers in an extraordinary circumstance and led her sopping class from the building. So, although she never breaks a rule or disobeys an order, she is often in trouble, and will never gain promotion. Competent as a student, she has reached her level of incompetence as a classroom teacher, and will therefore remain in that position throughout her teaching career. The eligible majority. Most beginning teachers are moderately competent or competent, see the area from B to D on the graph, and they will all be eligible for promotion. Here is one such case. A latent weakness. Mr. N. Beaker had been a competent student, and became a popular science teacher. His lessons and lab periods were inspiring. His students were cooperative and kept the laboratory in order. Mr. Beaker was not good at paperwork, but this week Ness was offset, in the judgment of his superiors, by his success as a teacher. Beaker was promoted to head of the science department where he now had to order all science supplies and keep extensive records. His incompetence is evident. For 3 years running he has ordered new Bunsen burners, but no tubing for connecting them. As the old tubing deteriorates, fewer and fewer burners are able, although new ones accumulate on the shelves. Beaker is not being considered for further promotion. His ultimate position is one for which he is incompetent. Higher up the hierarchy. B. Lunt had been a competent student, teacher and department head, and was promoted to assistant principal. In this post he got on well with teachers, students and parents, and was intellectually competent. He gained a further promotion to the rank of principal. Till now, he had never dealt directly with school board members, or with the district superintendent of education. It soon appeared that he lacked the required finesse to work with these high officials. He kept the superintendent waiting while he settled a dispute between two children. Taking a class for a teacher who was ill, he missed a curriculum revision committee meeting called by the assistant superintendent. He worked so hard at running his school that he had no energy for running community organizations. He declined offers to become program chairman of the Parent-Teacher Association, president of the Community Betterment League and consultant to the Committee for Decency and Literature. His school lost community support and he fell out of favor with the superintendent. Lunt came to be regarded, by the public and by his superiors, as an incompetent principal. When the assistant superintendent's post became vacant, the school board declined to give it to Lunt. He remains, and will remain till he retires, unhappy and incompetent as a principal. The autocrat R. Driver, having proved his competence as student, teacher, department head, assistant principal and principal, was promoted to assistant superintendent. Previously he had only to interpret the school board's policy and have it efficiently carried out in his school. Now, as assistant superintendent, he must participate in the policy discussions of the board, using democratic procedures. But Driver dislikes democratic procedures. He insists on his status as an expert. He lectures the board members much as he used to lecture his students when he was a classroom teacher. He tries to dominate the board as he dominated his staff when he was a principal. The board now considers Driver an incompetent assistant superintendent. He will receive no further promotion. Soon parted G. Spender was a competent student, English teacher, department head, assistant principal and principal. He then worked competently for 6 years as an assistant superintendent, patriotic, diplomatic, suave and well-liked. He was promoted to superintendent. Here he was obliged to enter the field of school finance, in which he soon found himself at a loss. From the start of his teaching career, Spender had never bothered his head about money. His wife handled his paycheck, paid all household accounts and gave him pocket money each week. Now Spender's incompetence in the area of finance is revealed. He purchased a large number of teaching machines from a fly-by-night company which went bankrupt without producing any programs to fit the machines. He had every classroom in the city equipped with television, although the only programs available in the area were for secondary schools. Spender has found his level of incompetence. Another promotion mechanism. The foregoing examples are typical of what are called line promotions. There is another mode of upward movement, the staff promotion. The case of Miss T. Totland is typical. Miss Totland, who had been a competent student and an outstanding primary teacher, was promoted to primary supervisor. She now has to teach, not children, but teachers. Yet she still uses the techniques which worked so well with small children. Addressing teachers, singly or in groups, she speaks slowly and distinctly. She uses mostly words of 1 or 2 syllables. She explains each point several times in different ways, to be sure it is understood. She always wears a bright smile. Teachers dislike what they call her false cheerfulness and her patronizing attitude. Their resentment is so sharp that, instead of trying to carry out her suggestions, they spend much time devising excuses for not doing what she recommends. Miss Totland has proved herself incompetent in communicating with primary teachers. She is therefore ineligible for further promotion, and will remain as primary supervisor, at her level of incompetence. You be the judge. You can find similar examples in any hierarchy. Look around you where you work, and pick out the people who have reached their level of incompetence. You will see that in every hierarchy the cream rises until it sours. Look in the mirror and ask whether. No. You would prefer to ask, are there no exceptions to the principle? Is there no escape from its operation? I shall discuss these questions in subsequent chapters. Chapter 3. Apparent exceptions. When the case goes bad, the guilty man accepts, and thins his jury all he can. J. Dryden. Many people to whom I mention the Peter Principle do not want to accept it. They anxiously search for, and sometimes think they have found, flaws in my hierarchological structure. So at this point I want to issue a warning: do not be fooled by apparent exceptions. Apparent exception no. I. The percussive sublimation. What about Walt Blockett's promotion? He was hopelessly incompetent, a bottleneck, so management kicked him upstairs to get him out of the road. I often hear such questions. Let us examine this phenomenon, which I have named the percussive sublimation. Did Blockett move from a position of incompetence to a position of competence? No. He has simply been moved from one unproductive position to another. Does he now undertake any greater responsibility than before? No. Does he accomplish any more work in the new position than he did in the old? No. The percussive sublimation is a pseudo-promotion. Some Blockett-type employees actually believe that they have received a genuine promotion, others recognize the truth. But the main function of a pseudo-promotion is to deceive people outside the hierarchy. When this is achieved, the maneuver is counted a success. But the experienced hierarchologist will never be deceived. Hierarchologically, the only move that we can accept as a genuine promotion is a move from a level of competence. What is the effect of a successful percussive sublimation? Assume that Blockett's employer, Kickley, is still competent. Then by moving Blockett he achieves 3 goals. 1. He camouflages the ill success of his promotion policy. To admit that Blockett was incompetent would lead observers to think Kickley should have realized, before giving Blockett that last promotion, that Blockett wasn't the man for the job. But a percussive sublimation justifies the previous promotion, in the eyes of employees and onlookers, not to a hierarchologist. 2. He supports staff morale. Some employees at least will think, if Blockett can get a promotion, I can get a promotion. One percussive sublimation serves as carrot on a stick to many other employees. 3. He maintains the hierarchy. Even though Blockett is incompetent, he must not be fired. He probably knows enough of Kickley's business to be dangerous in a competitive hierarchy. A common phenomenon hierarchology tells us that every thriving organization will be characterized by this accumulation of deadwood at the executive level, consisting of percussive sublimatees and potential candidates for percussive sublimation. One well-known appliance manufacture firm has 23 vice presidents, a paradoxical result. The Waverly Broadcasting Corporation is noted for the creativity of its production department. This is made possible through percussive sublimation. Waverly has just moved all its non-creative, non-productive, redundant personnel into a palatial, $3 million head office complex. The head office contains no cameras, microphones or transmitters. Indeed, it is miles away from the nearest studio. The people at head office are always frantically busy, drawing up reports and flowcharts and making appointments to confer with one another. Recently a reshuffle of senior officials was announced, aimed at streamlining the headquarters operation. 4 vice presidents were replaced by 8 vice presidents and a coordinating assistant to the president. So we see that the percussive sublimation can serve to keep the drones out of the hair of the workers. Apparent exception no. 2. The lateral arabesque. The lateral arabesque is another pseudo-promotion. Without being raised in rank, sometimes without even a pay raise, the incompetent employee is given a new and longer title and is moved to an office in a remote part of the building. Our Filewood proved incompetent as office manager of Cardley Stationery Incorporated after a lateral arabesque he found himself, at the same salary, working as coordinator of interdepartmental communications, supervising the filing of second copies of interoffice memos. Automotive Manufacturing File, Case No. 8 Wheeler Automobile Parts Limited has developed the lateral arabesque more fully than most hierarchies. The Wheeler operations are divided into many regions, and at last count, I found that 25 senior executives had been banished to the provinces as regional vice presidents. The company bought a motel and ordered one senior official to go and run it. Another redundant vice president has been laboring for 3 years to write the company's history. I conclude that the larger the hierarchy, the easier is the lateral arabesque. A case of levitation. The entire 82-man staff of a small government department was moved away to another department, leaving the director, at $16,000 a year, with nothing to do and nobody to supervise. Here we see the rare phenomenon of a hierarchical pyramid consisting solely of the capstone, suspended aloft without a base to support it. This interesting condition I denominate the free-floating apex. Apparent exception No. 3. Peter's inversion. A friend of mine was traveling in a country where the sale of alcoholic beverages is a government monopoly. Just before returning home he went to a government liquor store and asked, "How much liquor am I allowed to take back home with me?" "You'll have to ask the customs officers at the border," said the clerk. "But I want to know now," said the traveler, "so that I can buy all the liquor that is permissible, and yet not buy too much and get some of it confiscated." "It's a customs regulation," replied the clerk. "It's nothing to do with us." "But surely you know the customs regulation," said the traveler. "Yes, I know it," said the clerk, "but customs regulations are not a responsibility of this department, so I'm not allowed to tell you." Have you ever had a similar experience, ever been told, "We don't give out that information"? The official knows the answer to your problem, you know that he knows it, but for some reason or other, he won't tell you. Once, taking a professorship at a new university, I received a special identification card, issued by the payroll department of the university, entitling me to cash checks at the university bookstore. I went to the store, presented my card, and proffered a $20 American Express traveler's check. "We only cash payroll checks and personal checks," said the bookstore cashier. "But this is better than a personal check," I said. "It's better even than a payroll check. I can cash this in any store even without this special card. A traveler's check is as good as cash." "But it's not a payroll check or a personal check," said the cashier. After a little more discussion, I asked to see the manager. He listened to me patiently, but with a faraway expression, then stated flatly, "We do not cash travelers' checks. You have heard of hospitals which spend precious time filling in sheaves of forms before helping accident victims. You have heard of the nurse who says, 'Wake up. It's time to take your sleeping pill.' You may have read of the Irishman, Michael Patrick O'Brien, who was kept for 11 months on a ferryboat plying between Hong Kong and Macau. He did not have the correct papers to get off at either end of the trip, and nobody would issue them to him. Particularly among minor officials with no discretionary powers, one sees an obsessive concern with getting forms filled out correctly, whether the forms serve any useful purpose or not. No deviation, however slight, from the customary routine, will be permitted. Professional automatism. The above type of behavior I call professional automatism. To the professional automaton it is clear that means are more important than ends, the paperwork is more important than the purpose for which it was originally designed. He no longer sees himself as existing to serve the public, he sees the public as the raw material that serves to maintain him, the forms, the rituals and the hierarchy. The professional automaton, from the viewpoint of his customers, clients or victims, seems incompetent. So you will no doubt be wondering, how do so many professional automatons win promotion? And is the professional automaton outside the operation of the Peter Principle? To answer those questions I must first pose another, who defines competence? A question of standards. The competence of an employee is determined not by outsiders but by his superior in the hierarchy. If the superior is still at a level of competence, he may evaluate his subordinates in terms of the performance of useful work, For example, the supplying of medical services or information, the production of sausages or table legs, or achieving whatever are the stated aims of the hierarchy. That is to say, he evaluates output. But if the superior has reached his level of incompetence, he will probably rate his subordinates in terms of institutional values. He will see competence as the behavior that supports the rules, rituals and forms of the status quo. Promptness, neatness, courtesy to superiors, internal paperwork, will be highly regarded. In short, such an official evaluates input. Rockman is dependable. Luber contributes to the smooth running of the office. Rudder is methodical. Miss Trudgeon is a steady, consistent worker. Mrs. Friendly cooperates well with colleagues. In such instances, internal consistency is valued more highly than efficient service. This is Peter's inversion. A professional automaton may also be termed a Peter's invert. He has inverted the means-end relationship. Now you can understand the actions of the Peter's inverts described earlier. If the liquor store clerk had promptly explained the customs regulations, the traveler would have thought, "How courteous." But his superior would have marked the clerk down for breaking a rule of the department. If the bookstore cashier had accepted my traveler's check, I would have considered him helpful. The manager would have reprimanded him for exceeding his authority. Promotion prospects for Peter's inverts. The Peter's invert or professional automaton has, as we have seen, little capacity for independent judgment. He always obeys, never decides. This, from the viewpoint of the hierarchy, is competence, so the Peter's invert is eligible for promotion. He will continue to rise unless some mischance places him in a post where he has to make decisions. Here he will find his level of incompetence. Superscript 1. We see therefore that professional automatism, however annoying you may have found it, is not, after all, an exception to the Peter principle. As I often tell my students, competence, like truth, beauty and contact lenses, is in the eye of the beholder. Apparent exception no. 4. Hierarchical exfoliation. Next I shall discuss a case which to untrained observers is perhaps the most puzzling of all, the case of the brilliant, productive worker who not only wins no promotion, but is even dismissed from his post. Let me give a few examples, then I will explain them. In Excelsior City every new schoolteacher is placed on 1 year's probation. K. Buckman had been a brilliant English scholar at the university. In his probationary year of English teaching, he managed to infuse his students with his own enthusiasm for classical and modern literature. Some of them obtained Excelsior City Public Library cards, some began to haunt new and used bookstores. They became so interested that they read many books that were not on the Excelsior School's approved reading list. Before long, several irate parents and delegations from 2 austere religious sects visited the school superintendent to complain that their children were studying undesirable literature. Buckman was told that his services would not be required the following year. Probationer Teacher C. Cleary's first teaching assignment was to a special class of retarded children. Although he had been warned that these children would not accomplish very much, he proceeded to teach them all he could. By the end of the year, many of Cleary's retarded children scored better on standardized achievement tests of reading and arithmetic than did children in regular classes. When Cleary received his dismissal notice, he was told that he had grossly neglected the bead stringing, sandbox and other busy work which were the things that retarded children should do. He had failed to make adequate use of the modeling clay, pegboards and finger paints specially provided by the Excelsior City Special Education Department. Miss E. Beaver, a probationer primary teacher, was highly gifted intellectually. Being inexperienced, she put into practice what she had learned at college about making allowances for pupils' individual differences. As a result, her brighter pupils finished 2 or 3 years' work in 1 year. The principal was very courteous when he explained that Miss Beaver could not be recommended for permanent engagement. He knew she would understand that she had upset the system, had not stuck to the course of studies, and had created hardship for the children who would not fit into the next year's program. She had disrupted the official marking system and textbook issuing system, and had caused severe anxiety to the teacher who would next year have to handle the children who had already covered the work. The paradox explained. These cases illustrate the fact that, in most hierarchies, supercompetence is more objectionable than incompetence. Ordinary incompetence, as we have seen, is no cause for dismissal, it is simply a bar to promotion. Supercompetence often leads to dismissal, because it disrupts the hierarchy, and thereby violates the first commandment of hierarchical life: the hierarchy must be preserved. You will recall that in Chapter 2 I discussed 3 classes of employees: the incompetent, the moderately competent and the competent. At that time, for simplicity's sake, I chopped off the 2 extremes of the distribution curve and omitted 2 more classes of employees. Here is the complete curve. Employees in the 2 extreme classes, the supercompetent and the superincompetent, are alike subject to dismissal. They are usually fired soon after being hired, for the same reason, that they tend to disrupt the hierarchy. This sloughing off of extremes is called hierarchical exfoliation. Some horrible examples: I have already described the fate of some supercompetent employees. Here are some examples of superincompetence. Miss P. Saucier was hired as a salesgirl in the appliance department of the low-marked department store. From the start she sold less than the average amount of merchandise. This alone would not have been cause for dismissal, because many other salespeople were below average. But Miss Saucier's record-keeping was atrocious. She punched wrong keys on the cash register, accepted competitors' credit cards and, still worse, inserted the carbon paper with the wrong side up when filling in a sales contract form. She then managed to give the customer the original of the contract. He left with the 2 records, one on the front of the contract and the other in reverse on the back, and she was left with none. Worst of all, she was insolent to her superiors. She was dismissed after 1 month. W. Kirk, a Protestant clergyman, held radical views on the nature of the deity, the efficacy of the sacraments, the second coming of Christ, and life after death, views sharply opposed to the official doctrines of his sect. Technically, then, Kirk was incompetent to give his parishioners the spiritual guidance they expected. He received no promotion, of course, nevertheless he retained his post for several years. Then he wrote a book which condemned the stodgy church hierarchy and propounded a reasoned argument favoring taxation of all churches. He asked that ecclesiastical recognition be extended to such social problems as homosexuality, drug abuses, racial injustices and the like. He had moved, at one jump, from incompetence to superincompetence, and was promptly dismissed. The superincompetent exfoliate must have 2 important characteristics. 1. He fails to produce output. 2. He fails to support internal consistency of the hierarchy input. Is exfoliation for you? We see, then, that supercompetence and superincompetence are equally objectionable to the typical hierarchy. We see, too, that hierarchical exfoliates, like all other employees, are subject to the Peter Principle. They differ from other employees in being the only types who, under present conditions, are subject to dismissal. Would you like to be somewhere else? Is your present placement in military service, school or business your choice, or are you a victim of legal or family pressure? With planning and determination you, too, can make yourself either supercompetent or superincompetent. Apparent exception no. 5. The paternal instep. Some owners of old-fashioned family businesses used to treat their sons like regular employees. The boy would start at the bottom of the hierarchy and rise in accordance with the Peter Principle. Here, of course, the owner's love for his hierarchy, his desire to keep it efficient and profitable, and his stern sense of justice, outweighed his natural familial affections. Often, though, the owner of such a business would bring his son in at a high level with the idea that in time, without rising through the ranks, he should take over the supreme command or, as the phrase went, should step into his father's shoes. This type of placement, therefore, I call the paternal instep. There are 2 principal means by which the paternal instep is executed. P. Is method no. An existing employee may be dismissed or removed by lateral arabesque or percussive sublimation, to make a place for the instepper. Used less often than method no. 2. This technique may cause considerable ill feeling toward the new appointee. Is method no. 2. A new position, with an impressive title, is created for the instepper. The method explained. The paternal instep is merely a small-scale example of the situation that exists under a class system, where certain favored individuals enter a hierarchy above the class barrier, instead of at the bottom. The infusion of new employees at a high level may sometimes increase output. The paternal instep, therefore, arouses no ill feeling outside the hierarchy. Yet the arrival of the instepper is to a degree resented by other members of the hierarchy. Employees actually have a sentimental feeling, Peter's penchant, for the promotion process by which they themselves have risen and by which they hope to rise further. They tend to resent placements made by other means. The paternal instep today, the family business, controlled by one man with the authority to place his sons in its higher ranks, is nowadays something of a rarity. Nevertheless, the paternal instep is still executed in just the same way, except that the instepper need not be related to the official who appoints him. Let me cite a typical example. Paternal instep file, case no. 7a, Purefoy, director of the Excelsior City Health and Sanitation Department, found that by the end of one financial year he was going to have some unexpended funds. The citizens had suffered no epidemics, the Excelsior River had not, as it often did, overflowed its banks and silted up the drainage system. Both his assistant directors, one for health, the other for sanitation, were earnest, competent, economically minded men. So the budgeted funds had not been spent. Purefoy realized that unless he took rapid action he would suffer a cut in the coming year's budget. He determined to create a third assistant directorship whose incumbent would organize an anti-litter and city beautification program. To fill the new post he engaged W. Pickwick, a young graduate from the School of Business Administration of his own alma mater. Pickwick, in turn, created 11 more new posts, an anti-litter supervisor, 6 litter inspectors, a 3-girl office staff, and a public relations officer. N. Wordsworth, the P.R.O., organized essay contests for school children, adult contests for jingles and poster designs, and commissioned 2 films, one of anti-litter propaganda, the other on city beautification. The films were to be made by an independent producer who had been with Wordsworth and Pickwick in the University Dramatic Society. Everything worked out well. Director Purefoy exceeded his budget and was successful in obtaining a larger budget for the following year. Modern father substitutes. Nowadays governments set up the father shoe situation. Federal grants are offered for many new purposes: war on pollution, war on poverty, war on illiteracy, war on loneliness, war on illegitimacy, and research into the recreational potential of interplanetary space travel for the culturally disadvantaged. As soon as money is offered, a way must be found to spend it. A new position is created: anti-poverty coordinator, Head Start director, book selection advisor, organizer for senior citizens' welfare and happiness projects, or what have you. Someone is recruited to occupy the position, to wear, if not necessarily to fill, the shoes. The instepper may or may not solve the problem that he was set to solve. That does not matter. The important point is that he must be able and willing to spend the money. The principle not breached. Such a placement is in accordance with the Peter principle. Competence or incompetence is irrelevant so long as the shoes are filled. If they are filled competently, the instepper will in time be eligible to step up and out of them and find his level of incompetence on a higher plane. Conclusions: the apparent exceptions are not exceptions. The Peter principle applies to all employees in all hierarchies. Chapter 4. Pull and promotion. A long pull, and a strong pull, and a pull altogether. C. Dickens. You have seen that the Peter principle is immutable and universal, but you may still want to know how long your hierarchical ascension will take. Chapters 4 and 5 will help reveal this to you. First, let us turn our attention to accelerated elevation through pull. Pull defined in 16 words. I define pull as an employee's relationship, by blood, marriage or acquaintance, with a person above him in the hierarchy. Unpopularity of the pulley winning promotion through pull is a thing we all hate, and other people. Coworkers dislike the beneficiary of pull, the pulley, and usually express that dislike in comments on his incompetence. Soon after W. Kinsman became superintendent of schools in Excelsior City, his son-in-law, L. Harker, was promoted to the post of music supervisor. Some teachers criticized this appointment on the ground that Harker was hard of hearing. They said the music supervisor's post belonged by right of seniority, input, to D. Rohn. Envy knows no logic. D. Rohn had listened so long to so many school choirs and orchestras that he hated music and children. Obviously, he would have been no more competent, in terms of output, than Harker as music supervisor. The teacher's resentment, then, was not really against Harker's incompetence, but against his violation of the time-honored seniority system. Employees in a hierarchy do not really object to incompetence, Peter's paradox, they merely gossip about incompetence to mask their envy of employees who have pull. How to acquire pull? One may study the careers of many employees who had pull, pulleys, comparing them with employees of equal ability who had none. The results of my research can be reduced to 5 practical suggestions for the would-be pulley. 1. Find a patron. A patron is a person above you in the hierarchy who can help you to rise. Sometimes you may have to do a good deal of scouting to find who has, and who has not, this power. You may think that your promotion rate depends on the good or bad reports written about you by your immediate superior. This may be correct. But management may be aware that your immediate superior is already at his level of incompetence, and therefore may attach little importance to his recommendations, favorable or otherwise. So do not be superficial, dig deep, and ye shall find. 2. Motivate the patron. An unmotivated patron is no patron. See that the patron has something to gain by assisting you, or something to lose by not assisting you, to rise in the hierarchy. My research has yielded many examples of this motivation process, some charming, some sordid. I shall not cite them. I would rather make this point a test for the reader, a test which I call Peter's Bridge. If you cannot cross it under your own steam, you have already reached your level of incompetence and no advice from me can help you. 3. Get out from under. There's no road like the open road. Imagine you are at a swimming pool, trying to climb to the high diving board. Halfway up the ladder, your ascent is blocked by a would-be diver who began to climb but has now lost his nerve. Eyes shut, he clings desperately to the handrail. He will not fall off, but he cannot go higher, and you cannot pass him. Encore. Aging shouts from your friend already on the top board are of no avail in this situation. Similarly, in an occupational hierarchy, neither your own efforts, nor the pull of your patron, can help you if the next step above you is blocked by someone at his level of incompetence, a superincumbent. This awkward situation I denominate Peter's pretty pass. Things have come to a pretty pass, etc. Let us return mentally to the swimming pool. To reach the top of the diving board, you would get off the ladder that is blocked, cross over to the ladder on the other side, and climb without hindrance to the top. To move up the job hierarchy, you get out from under the superincumbent and move into a promotion channel that is not blocked. This maneuver is called Peter's circumambulation. Before investing time and effort in Peter's circumambulation, make sure that you really are in Peter's pretty pass, i.e., that the man above you is a genuine superincumbent. If he is still eligible for promotion, he is not a superincumbent, you need not dodge round him. Simply exert a little patience, wait a while, he will be promoted, a gap will open up and pull will be able to do its wondrous work. To discover, without any doubt, whether your superior is a superincumbent, look for the medical and non-medical indices of final placement, which are described in chapters 11 and 12 of this book. 4. Be flexible. There is only so much that any one patron can do for you. To draw an analogy, an experienced mountaineer can pull a weaker climber up to his level. Then the leader must himself climb higher before he can exert more pull. But if the first patron cannot climb higher, then the pulley must find another patron who can. So be prepared, when the time comes, to switch your allegiance to another patron of higher rank than the first. There's no patron like a new patron. 5. Obtain multiple patronage. The combined pull of several patrons is the sum of their separate pulls multiplied by the number of patrons. Hull's theorem: the multiplication effect occurs because the patrons talk among themselves and constantly reinforce in one another their opinions of your merits, and their determination to do something for you. With a single patron, you get none of this reinforcement effect. Many a patron makes a promotion. Why wait? Escalate. By following these hints, you can obtain pull. Pull will speed your upward motion through the hierarchy. It can bring you to your level much sooner. Theory. Lawrence Johnson Peter, Canadian educator and psychologist, 1919–1990. After graduating in 1958 from Western Washington State College, Lawrence J. Peter, originally from Vancouver, quickly became a teacher while pursuing studies in psychology and education sciences, in which he obtained a doctorate degree in 1963. He then directed the Evelyn Frieden Center and acted as an advisor for programs that experienced difficulties at the University of Southern California in 1966. His first book, Prescriptive Teaching, was published in 1965, but it was not until the publication of The Peter Principle, 1969, written in collaboration with Raymond Hall, Canadian writer, 1919–1985, that he became well known. The Hypotheses of the Peter Principle. The Peter Principle, like all economic models, is based on hypotheses that are useful to investigate. If we only look at the most important, these include, but are not limited to: the hierarchical structure of a company is naturally in the form of a pyramid. This simplified view shows the strictly defined hierarchical levels. Basic workers are led by a few managers, who are themselves managed by even fewer superior executives, and so on. Back to a certain time, and companies are currently much more flexible organizations that work from a project or network. For example, the strongest and most controversial hypothesis is what the book refers to as the Peter Hypothesis. The level of competence required for a higher hierarchical position is completely independent of the competence required for a hierarchically inferior position. If an employee is the most suitable for a position and is promoted to a higher level, his level of competence after that promotion is completely unpredictable. According to Jean-Paul Delahaye, French computer scientist and mathematician, born in 1952, if we accept these simplistic assumptions, we are logically assuming that all promotions have a tendency to reduce an employee's performance due to two effects. The ratchet effect: backtracking is impossible as an employee cannot be demoted. If he is competitive, he will continue to climb the ladder and will not remain in a position where he is efficient. The movement will effectively continue until he reaches a level that is too high, in which he is no longer efficient. The employee is then stuck at this level and cannot be demoted nor continue to rise. The statistical effect of regressing towards the average, of the principle of statistical distribution, during a random, normal event, the probability of achieving a result close to average is higher than getting a very high or very low result. Thus, the company, which is fortunate enough to be able to count on an employee that is well above average competency and decides to change their position, once again determines the competence of the employee with a good chance of achieving an average result. Behind the hypotheses of the Peter Principle lies an inconvenient truth: over time, each position is increasingly likely to be occupied by an incompetent employee, while the higher up a position is in the hierarchy, the more important it is to the overall performance of the structure. This does not mean that the base of the pyramid is any less essential to the proper functioning of the business than the top. It is in fact the reverse. Put simply, if we accept the pyramid structure and place equal emphasis on each level, a position has more importance for the overall performance when there are fewer positions within that level. For example, if there are 2 managers for 5 employees, the individual competence of the manager AC counts for 50% of the performance of its hierarchical level, while the individual performance of each employee only accounts for 20%. In the hypotheses of the Peter principle, particularly that of the ratchet effect, it seems clear that every employee tends to rise to his level of incompetence, so that the natural balance of a structure is that each position is occupied by someone who cannot bear the responsibilities, the incompetent employees. This principle was conceived by Lawrence J. Peter as part of a complete science of organizations that he called hierarchology. This seeks to provide concrete applications and confronts his model with the reality of the organizations that he observed. Of course, he notes exceptions to the principle. For example, the most competent are not always promoted. He highlights several cases where incompetent employees are promoted and explains why. Powerful sublimation or pseudo-development, this strategy, which promotes an incompetent employee to an upper level, mainly serves to maintain the hope of all others who believe they may also be promoted one day. This is dangerous because it is just an illusion for people who are not part of the hierarchy. Lateral arabesque, this promotes an incompetent employee to a new, useless position with a grander title to limit the damage he may cause in his current position. Peter reversal, in this case, the promotion of an incompetent employee is due to their compliance with standards imposed by the hierarchy rather than their efficiency. The end effect and means are reversed, since the standards exist to increase productivity and give as much value to compliance of standards as to productivity. Hierarchical defoliation, to avoid workers perceiving the absurdity of the system and deciding not to comply, the company favors the promotion of an incompetent employee. Signs of the last position. According to Peter, the signs of incompetence, or the signs of hiding incompetence from others and oneself, are easy to detect. These are called signs of the last position, however, they give the illusion of professional fulfillment. Classophilia, from the Greek word klassis, meaning category or class, this is an unnecessary obsession with classification to give, themselves, the illusion that they are doing important work. Gigantism tabula, refers to the incompetent employee who wants the biggest office. Papyromania, from the Greek word papyros, paper, and the Latin word mania, madness or obsession, this is a sign of an incompetent employee who piles up paperwork, hence the apparent disorder, on his desk to give the impression that he is extremely busy. Papyrophobia, from the Greek words papyros, paper, and phobos, phobia, is a sign of an incompetent employee who cannot tolerate any paper in their workspace. If the office is organized, colleagues, superiors, and perhaps even the employee himself, will believe that work is being done efficiently. Phonophilia, from the Greek words phone, voice, and philos, friend, this is a sign of incompetence which involves blaming a lack of contact with colleagues and subordinates and installing multiple phones and tape recorders in the office. Since this idea first appeared in 1969, this sign should probably be rephrased based on current technologies. Rigor cardis, of Latin origin, this indicates an obsessive interest in graphics, diagrams and charts that give the illusion of control over situations. Initial siglomania, from the Latin word sigla, meaning markings or abbreviations, and mania, meaning madness or obsession, this is a sign where the incompetent employee will speak using incomprehensible initials and acronyms with non-initiated staff, to give the impression of professionalism. He will complicate things as he takes pleasure in the importance this gives him. Structurophilia, from the Latin word structure, arrangement, construction, and the Greek philos, friend, this involves enjoying work in a certain structure. The incompetent employee that shows evidence of this sign will be obsessed with the order and maintenance of the building where he works, to the detriment of enjoying the work itself. Flutter syndrome, the incompetent employee rarely makes decisions and allows them to wait a long time before being processed. Abnormal tabula, from the Latin word tabula, plate or table, this is a sign of incompetence where the employee uses unusual and strange office equipment. However, Peter qualifies his statements by explaining that, Fortunately for the functioning of our political, social and economic models, all positions at the top of the hierarchy are not necessarily occupied by incompetent employees. In fact, in this clarification of the principle, he highlights the fact that the hierarchical structure of an organization is often too small for all of the competent people, although this is not too big a fault, as otherwise they would suffer from hierarchical defoliation, to reach their potential. Nonetheless, note that the competent superiors are often headhunted by larger organizations where they are once again able to move up until they too reach their level of incompetence. Limitations and criticisms. The limits of the model are obvious as soon as one considers the hypotheses that it is based on. At the moment, an organization is often not as simple as the pyramid structure described by Peter. Most of the time, an employee who coordinates authors has not been promoted. The various departments are on equal footing, at least in theory. Decentralization and empowerment are encouraged, and there is a tendency to reduce the straightforward vertical hierarchy. This phenomenon is called the flattening of the pyramids. Perhaps it is precisely one of the contemporary ways to avoid the effects of the Peter principle, which originate from a time when hierarchy was more rigid. A position is no longer frozen. If an incompetent employee is appointed to a position and does not assume its responsibilities, it is likely that many of the functions will be progressively assigned to another position. The issue of motivation is also problematic, since some skills shown by the worker can come from this. Indeed, the employee may be efficient at one level of the hierarchy, partially due to motivation. If he continues this enthusiasm, he is likely to acquire the new skills required for the new position more easily, making him more efficient. The current realities of turnover are impressive, since it is estimated that a young person entering the labor market is likely to change their function or business approximately 5 times. Finally, certainly the most questionable Peter hypothesis is that the competency shown in one position is inherently independent from the competency proved in a previous position. Other researchers, such as the Italian physicists Alessandro Pluchino, Andrea Rapisarda, and sociologist Cesar Garofalo in their article The Peter Principle Revisited, a computational study, offer a revisited perspective of the famous principle by stating the opposite hypothesis. They call it the common sense hypothesis. Competency in a higher position depends on the competency shown in a lower position and is increased or decreased by approximately 10%. The empirical testing of incompetence developed by Peter can also be unreliable. Indeed, the symptoms include so many different behaviors that we cannot, as some do, use them as supposed proof of the Peter principle. If we consider the face value of certain hypotheses, we will eventually be confronted with situations such as this: the person who likes organization too much or is too authoritative is incompetent, but the person who is not organized enough or is not authoritative is also incompetent. If excess is always a bad thing, the majority of the alleged symptoms can originally be perceived as qualities. Also, is it the reason why an incompetent employee adopts these attitudes, but to the extreme, to try to hide his incompetence? In conclusion, the Peter principle is unverifiable, and the satirical tone he uses in his work suggests that it has no real scientific claim. Related models and extensions. The Peter principle is part of a set of laws of the same type, of a more or less humorous style, which describe the corporate world with a certain cynicism and whose scientific rigor is not its biggest concern. However, some of them point out the challenging realities with which most organizations must effectively cope. Parkinson's Law. Among these, in particular there is Parkinson's Law, 1955, from the British historian Cyril Northcote Parkinson, 1909 to 1993, which states that the work is always spread out in order to fill the time available to the person in charge of the work. By extension, we can imagine that all available resources for our project are used. Whether they are time, money, manpower, etc., there are 2 consequences underpin this law. Increase of subordinates. If an employee fails to complete a project, he only has 2 options. He can either unload a portion of the work by giving it to someone who could become a potential rival, or he can request the support of his subordinates. In most cases, The second option is chosen, firstly to protect his position and secondly to increase his importance. It should be noted that he will ensure he has several subordinates, so as to share each task. That way, since none of them are able to perform the whole task, no one will become a potential rival. Increase of workload. Whether working with equals or subordinates, the fact is that when there are several people working, the workload increases. It often takes as much time to coordinate the task as it does to do the work. As there is almost always someone in the team who has trouble delegating and takes on more responsibility, the work will rectify itself in the end to match what one person could have produced alone. Ultimately, to produce the same work, as only one person would have produced, it takes a whole team dedicated to it, and additional time was spent coordinating all of these people. The Dilbert Principle. We will also mention the Dilbert Principle, derived from an eponymous comic strip by Scott Adams, American cartoonist, born in 1957. According to him, the incompetent employees are immediately promoted and become managers, even if they have never shown any special skills. This principle is even more radical than the Peter Principle, since it assumes that we consciously entrust management functions to incompetent employees so that they cannot cause any damage. This, of course, assumes that management is always useless. Similarly, we can cite the popular saying that those who can, do, those who can't, teach, although we cannot call them models as such, because they are not scientific. These principles show some empirical resistance to the theoretical performance of economic models. Should we give up on these models, the limits of which we know in reality, and consider granting promotions at random? Practical application. The case studies where the Peter Principle is at work are both numerous and non-existent at the same time. They are numerous, since each of us easily manages to imagine a situation where an incompetent employee is promoted, recognizing the signs described by Peter among our colleagues or superiors. As for saying that they actually prove incompetence, that is another matter. It is quite difficult, and most human resource managers know this well, to measure the performance of an employee. Similarly, employees will often tend to find their superior incompetent because it is easier to criticize others than to take responsibility. Most of the time, literature presents cases where incompetence is claimed, but comes from little more than the imagination of Peter Principle supporters. In this sense, real case examples are non-existent. Study of Catania. Instead of telling anecdotes, Alessandro Pluchino, Andrea Rapisarda and Cesar Garofalo, in their article The Peter Principle Revisited, a computational study, preferred to try a different way of tackling the model in reality. They used a computer simulation of the evolution of the pyramid structure by varying the hypotheses of promotion. Their article revealed astonishing findings, earning them an Ig Nobel Prize in Economics, a parody of the Nobel Prize that rewards the most unusual research. However, their study is nevertheless very serious, and the bizarre nature of the results reinforces the thinking and humorous hypotheses developed by Peter. Definition of a fictitious organization. Therefore, they created, on a computer program, using NetLogo, a programming language specifically designed for conducive multi-agent simulation to test different aspects of game theory, a fictitious organization made up of 6 hierarchical levels, containing 81, 41, 21, 11, 5 and 1 agents respectively. Each agent is characterized by an age ranging from 18 to 60 and a skill level from 1 to 10. At the beginning of the simulation, ages and skills levels are randomly determined on the basis of the statistical distribution described above. Normal statistical distribution. A statistical distribution gives a strong probability of near-average results, arbitrarily set to 0 on the chart, and an increasingly low probability as we try to get a result that moves away from the top or the bottom. This is considered to be the form of chance that best describes the reality of large samples and, by definition, we find far more average events than exceptional events. Simulation. Once the initial situation is established, the simulation can begin. In each round of the game, the age of the agents is increased. Each agent who reaches 60 DSAP pairs, and the gaps are filled by promoting agents from the lower levels. The gaps in the lowest level are filled by adding new agents whose ages and skills are determined randomly. When an agent changes level, his competence also changes according to the two tested hypotheses. The Peter hypothesis. The new level of competence is completely random. The common sense hypothesis. The new level of competence shows a maximum 10% increase or decrease compared with the previous level. In both cases, it is necessary to measure the overall performance of the system, which corresponds to the average performance of all levels. Note that the more an employee climbs the ladder, the more his individual performance should increase. Naturally, the question facing researchers is the same one that faces any manager: who should be promoted? For each hypothesis, the researchers tested 3 types of promotion: promoting the best employee, promoting the most incompetent employee, promoting a randomly selected employee. Results. Very quickly, the performance of the system reached a point of equilibrium. Under the common sense hypothesis, there is no real surprise. A good overall performance is achieved when the best people are promoted, and a poor overall performance when incompetent people are promoted. Random promotion does not have a major impact on overall performance. On the other hand, if we look at the Peter hypothesis, a surprising conclusion, which is the opposite of that found by the Ig Nobel-winning Italian researchers, is clear: we must promote the incompetent employees. Indeed, if you move a poor worker to a higher level, there is a good chance he will be replaced by someone better than him, the majority of agents being average. In addition to this, the performance of the poor workers will be replayed, randomly drawn again, through his reassignment, with a good chance of getting an average result once again. And if the chance results in a bad outcome, he will still proceed to the next round. Thus, promoting the most incompetent employees is the logical conclusion in the Peter hypothesis. Then, as is the case of the common sense hypothesis, chance remains neutral. As for the promotion of the best employees, it works exactly as Peter described: it propels everyone to their level of incompetence, making the overall performance defective. Conclusion. Therefore, either Peter is right and we can only advise managers to promote the worst employees, or we accept that competence at a higher level is a simple variation of competence at lower levels, and promoting the best workers remains the preferred solution. Advice. Overall, Peter approaches the problem in too static and simplistic a manner. Why should the competence for a given position be considered a constant? If the human resource management system in place is effective, regulatory performance measures should be followed by interviews with officials and staff training to increase the efficiency of their work. Of course, this presents several disadvantages. Firstly, we need relevant key performance indicators to determine the quality of work as objectively as possible. In the case of a seller, would be sufficient, for example, to simply measure the number of potential customers who entered the store. More and more shops are installing sensors for this purpose, the amount collected by the seller and the relationship between the two. However, the calculation of performance is more risky when it comes to measuring the quality of work produced by a civil servant or an office worker. Peter himself, when speaking of incompetence, gives the impression that it is based more on a widespread feeling than on specific indicators. Secondly, an effective human resource system and training are more difficult to implement and more expensive than simply measuring employee performance and directly promoting the right employee based on past experience. Whether the Peter hypothesis is true or not, managers may consider the hierarchy in two opposite ways. If each function and the skills related to it are clearly defined, it is much simpler to implement key performance indicators and assess performance. If, on the contrary, some uncertainty is deliberately left regarding the tasks that each employee must carry out, it is much easier to relieve a worker of some of the tasks for which he is not competent, but this has a considerable impact on efficiency. Moreover, it is possible to make workers more mobile by removing the ratchet FFECT. Demotions are more common than Peter seems to believe. When the Peter hypothesis does not hold. If the Peter hypothesis is not verified, then the common sense system, which involves promoting the best workers, usually set up by organizations if fully efficient. It has the double advantage of motivating employees to scramble to perform better in the hope of getting a promotion, saving the organization money on training, as they themselves will make every effort to acquire the skill level required for the superior position. When the Peter hypothesis holds true. On the other hand, it is much more problematic if the Peter hypothesis proves to be true. If the most incompetent workers are promoted, this should be done discreetly due to the risk of demotivating employees. It is also necessary to focus on financial incentives and refrain from using the promotion system as a reward. This way of considering and giving promotions has its limitations, since it generates significant costs for the organization and does not find the person best suited for the position. Finally, if the Peter hypothesis corresponds to the reality of the organizations and the ratchet effect is as fixed as he believes, the only real solution is to support employees as effectively as possible by measuring the skills needed, motivating them and training them. This costs the organization much more than if the only competition experienced between employees made them competent at all levels of the hierarchy. Summary. The principle developed by Lawrence J. Peter and Raymond Hull appears in a satirical work entitled The Peter Principle from 1969, a time when businesses, facing a stable and economically sound environment, targeted the growth and development of their structure and therefore inevitably managed promotions. The principle is based on the following hypothesis: all organizations promote competent employees until they reach a position in which they cannot perform competently and from which they cannot be removed. The organization therefore moves towards widespread incompetence. The contribution lies mainly with managers who need to know how to manage the movements of their staff in order to improve the overall performance of their organization. They should, to that end, ensure the development of skills and collective intelligence, because no one is perfect, but a team can be. The hypotheses of the model cause controversy, particularly the hypothesis that claims the skills required for a new position are not dependent on those seen in the previous position. Other laws, including Parkinson's law on the natural tendency of organizations to eventually become ineffective, lean in the same direction as the Peter principle. Advice: if the Peter hypothesis does not hold, rely on common sense and promote the best employees. If the Peter hypothesis holds true, promote the worst employees without making it known, give financial incentives without changing the employee's role, observe each employee individually and operate movements within the same hierarchical level.